Hello, my name is George Kuru. I'm here to make a presentation on my perspective of forestry for solid wood products in Southeast Asia. Now, by Southeast Asia, I'm referring to countries in Indochina and in the island nations of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua. There are some small states that we haven't included in this presentation because they don't really have a significant forest industry. So of the 8 countries that we're looking at, they're really dominated by 4 big forestry companies, maybe 5 countries, with Indonesia being the dominant country, followed by Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia, with Myanmar being a significant forestry country, especially with teak. Now, during the presentation, I'm going to look at 3 sectors, being sawn timber, plywood, and veneer. And there are some general trends in that the timber industries have been dominated historically by Indonesia and Malaysia and a little bit in Thailand, and we're seeing over time that those countries' productions are generally declining, and then we're seeing the rise of Vietnam in Southeast Asia as a major forestry timber country. So if we have a look at sawn timber, we see that Indonesia and Malaysia have historically been the biggest producers of sawn timber, and over time those have significantly reduced, while we see a very large increase in the sawn timber production in Vietnam and Thailand. And these pie charts will sort of indicate how the various countries' contribution to sawn timber have changed over the decades. Now, if we have a look at the stacked graph, which is the total production by different countries, you'll see that there has been changes in sawn timber production over time, but generally the production levels have stayed at around 17 million cubic meters. But there have been large changes within countries in timber production. So if we try to get some insight into this, we see that there's been a long-term decline in sawn timber production in both Malaysia and Indonesia and probably Thailand. And this is due to the decline in natural forest log supplies. It's a well-known factor. One particular product that we're going to discuss in more detail is rubberwood. And we've seen the decline of rubberwood in Malaysia, who's historically been the main producer of that. But with the expansion of rubberwood plantations in Indochina and the development of rubberwood plantations for timber in Indonesia, this would indicate that there will be an upturn in rubberwood production in the medium to long term. Now, we've seen significant increases in sawn timber production in Vietnam and Thailand, and this is in part due to supplies of logs from plantations, as well as log imports from neighbouring countries and countries like New Zealand. Quite an interesting feature is that Papua New Guinea has created the world's second largest balsa wood plantation resource in East New Britain. And this is an interesting species, and there is a lot of interest in this species in other parts of Southeast Asia. And we just want to note that there are ongoing expansion of plantations of high-value timber species, such as teak, and a little bit of mahogany, mainly in the smallholder sector. If we have a look at the plywood sector, we'll see that again, Indonesia and Malaysia production has declined over time, not so much in Indonesia, but certainly in Malaysia. And there's been a very big increase in plywood production in Vietnam. In this case, unlike sawn timber, Thailand plywood has not really increased significantly. You can see the relative contributions of the countries in the pie charts there. And this is the total production of plywood in the region, and you'll see there's been a big decline in plywood production, but changes in the relative contributions of different countries. So if we have a look at this, again, the long-term decline in plywood production in Indonesia and Malaysia is related directly to the decline in natural forest log supplies. But the decline in Indonesia has been significantly less. And that's really due to the increase in plantation logs that are suitable for veneer and plywood production. And there are fast-growing species like Paracentensis falcateria and Anthocephalus cadamba, called Singon in Indonesia, and Jebon, and Albizia and Leron in Malaysia. And these fast-growing plantation species are substituting for natural forest logs in the production of plywood. And it seems that Malaysia now is sort of belatedly following this trend, with a policy move to expand plantations of these species, especially in Sabah. Now, the Vietnam expansion of production of plywood is very closely related to the increase in plantation-grown eucalyptus and acacia logs, as well as an expansion in importing from neighbouring countries and others. Now, there is an opportunity, I suppose, in Indonesia, which has a very large supply of plantation eucalyptus and acacia, which would be suitable for veneer and plywood production. But this really depends on the pulp and paper industry in Indonesia being convinced of the benefits before wood could be available for pulpwood and veneer. Now, if we have a look at the veneer sector, it's similar but different. So we see that Malaysia is again dropping significantly in its production of veneer, but Indonesia has increased substantially, and so has Vietnam. Now, when we look at the total annual production of veneer, there's been a really significant increase in veneer production over time. And that's largely due to the increases in Vietnam and Indonesia, which has compensated for the reductions in Malaysia. Now, particularly in Indonesia, there's been a significant increase in the production of veneer sheet, probably at the expense of plywood. Now, the long-term decline of veneer sheet production in Malaysia is due in part to the reduction in supply, but it's also due to their inability to compete with veneer from Indonesia and Malaysia. Their cost structures are significantly higher and they just can't compete, generally speaking. Now, Indonesia veneer sheet expansion has occurred mainly with plantation grown Singon, and also a move of natural forest logs from production of plywood to veneer sheets. And again, Vietnam has been expanding its production of veneer sheet using plantation-grown species. I just wanted to put a map up here so that people could get some picture of the situation. So Vietnam has had a well-known program of plantation expansion in fast-growing acacia and more recently eucalyptus. And so some of that wood is coming into the veneer and plywood sector as upgrades from pulpwood. I just wanted to make a note that in Laos there's been a significant change in that a company there called Mekong Timber Plantations, which has about 22,000 hectares of eucalyptus, has plans to establish a large veneer and plywood processing facility in the order of 150,000 1,000 cubic metres of roundwood. Now, this veneer and plywood that's being produced in Vietnam, it's quite unique in some ways. It's using rather basic rotary veneer equipment. You'll see that quite commonly the veneer is air dried outside, and then often packaged up and then on-sold to plywood producers. And you'll see quite a few of these sort of facilities in China as well. Now, I want to change directions a little bit of the discussion and focus on these fast-growing plantation species which are being used for plywood and veneer production. And it's these species, Paracensiensis falcateria and Anthocephalus cadamba. They're very fast-growing trees, often 50 metres cubic metres per hectare per year growth rates on good sites. And these species are being used mainly for veneer and plywood, as well as core board for blockboard. And they have the attribute of being low to medium low density. So initially these species were mainly cultivated by smallholders, but we do see a trend now of larger companies developing their own plantations, and it's a significant change. In PNG, they've developed this significant plantation based on balsa wood, which is a very fast-growing species, and this has produced a very high-value product, mainly for the use in wind turbines. Now, I wanted to follow up with this concept of forestry companies who are investing in fast-growing plantation species for solid wood products, for plywood and veneer. Most of the smallholder production was initially established in Java, which is just south of these areas. But, we see now a significant number of companies, developing large plantations. We have Semco in the Moluccas with quite old plantations looking to establish a large processing capability. We have Cutting and Timber Group in North Sulawesi with 15,000 hectares of sawn. In Sumatra, in Jambi, we have ADR Group who have 30,000 hectares of acacia and sawn plantations. The acacia now is being harvested and converted to sawn. And we see in Sabah the commitment of the state government to rapidly expand these fast-growing plantations of these fast-growing species. And interestingly, here in West Kalimantan, we have PTHKI, who've developed something like 20,000 hectares of rubber plantations, grown for rubber wood rather than latex. So for those who are not familiar with these fast-growing plantations, I've just got a couple of photos here, and the interesting feature of these plantations is that they're very young. These plantations are 20 years old. They're over 16, maybe 16 to 18 metres, and they're 30 centimetres diameter above. So they're tremendously fast growing. They're being harvested at age 6, 7, and yielding 300-400 cubic metres. This is Jabon, or Laran as they call it in Malaysia. And this is another very fast-growing species. It's a bit more site-specific, but you see it's very tall. It's got virtually no branches and produces really nice quality veneer and plywood. And lastly, over in Papua New Guinea, they've established several thousand hectares of balsa wood plantations, which has generating annual production of approximately 120,000 cubic metres of roundwood, and very fast-growing species. And these species are mainly being used to produce these wind turbines, very high value. So lastly, I'd want to just have a quick discussion on rubberwood, which has been a significant plantation species in the region. And historically, Peninsular Malaysia has been the leading source, along with places like Indonesia and Thailand. But the resource in Malaysia is in serious decline because the areas have been converted to palm oil. One really interesting thing is that the Sabah timber industry has prepared a master plan, and they're really focused now on accelerating the utilisation of significant areas of rubberwood in that state. And that's going to generate potentially very large volumes of logs on an annual basis, maybe in excess of 1 million cubic metres. Now, there has been increasing harvesting of rubberwood in Indonesia. I don't think it's sustainable in the long term, as well as in Thailand, and I think Thailand production is sustainable. And with the expansion of rubberwood plantations, of rubber plantings over the last 20 years in Indochina, there will be significant increases in supply of rubberwood from those countries. And lastly, we are seeing companies starting to invest in large rubberwood plantations for both timber and latex production. And further investment in rubberwood plantations is expected if latex prices can recover. So just to give you a quick overview, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia are the traditional strongholds of rubberwood. Malaysia is declining, but in Sabah and eastern Malaysia, there's likely to be a rapid increase in rubberwood availability. And here in West Kalimantan, we're seeing the development of very large-scale rubberwood plantations. And we're likely to see increases in the whole of Indochina of rubberwood production in the medium to long-term future. Now that's all I have to present today. Thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. Goodbye.